It's my pleasure this morning to introduce Martin Lamb. Martin is a senior lecturer in TESOL and coordinator of the MA TESOL studies at the University of Leeds. This is not his first time to India, but it is his first time as a speaker at the TEC conference. His paper today is going to talk about inspiring teachers. That is, state school teachers who generate long-term motivation. Now, I'm sure we can all remember from our own education how important these types of teachers are. And as teacher educators, we're well aware of how important they are as part of our teams. Martin's research is based on Martin's paper is based on research conducted in Guangzhou in China and Jakarta, Indonesia. So without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Martin Lamb.
Thank you, Phil, for the introduction. It is, yes, 23 years since I was last in India, and it's a great pleasure to be here again, and I'm very grateful to the conference organizers for inviting me to talk to you today. So my topic is inspiring teachers, and what I'm going to do is briefly I'm going to talk about why it's necessary, I think, to look for inspiring teachers, for examples of inspiring teachers. I will then report a small-scale research project that I and my colleague Martin Waddell from the University of Leeds have carried out in China and Indonesia to find some examples of inspiring English teachers. And then at the end, I will consider some of the implications of our research for advising teachers on how to inspire learners. So, what is an inspiring teacher? The origin of the term inspire is actually, it's a medieval term apparently, and it means to breathe spirit into someone. But it was actually an Indian gentleman in Leeds who I thought expressed it best of all. He said, "It's the kind of teacher who quickened my steps to school, on the way to school in the morning." That Indian gentleman also said that inspiring teachers are born, not made. And, well, we had a lively discussion because I disagreed with him. I said that inspiring teachers can be made, actually. There may be a small number who are born great, but most of us can aspire to inspire. We learn how to do it. So that's one of the basic assumptions that underlie my presentation. Inspiring teachers can be made, and training can help. I think as trainers of teachers, we need to know what makes teachers inspiring to inform our work. Korthagen has said there are two central questions in determining the pedagogy of teacher education. Firstly, what are the qualities of what are the essential qualities of a good teacher? And secondly, how can we help people to become good teachers? So, as part of the first question, we need to know what is a good teacher. And I think no one would disagree that being inspiring is part of being a good teacher. It's not the only thing. I think a good teacher has to have technical skills as well. They have to know how a skill or knowledge is developed. But inspiring learners to learn for themselves is also part of being a good teacher. And we could say that inspiring teachers are motivating teachers as well. However, maybe a little bit more than just motivating. I mean, obviously there's a clear overlap between the terms to motivate and to inspire. But I think Dernier and Ushida in their book put their finger on it when they say there is a critical difference, though, between motivating students and developing their motivation. There's a difference between getting learners to do what we want them to do in our class and inspiring them to study English by themselves over the long term. So, motivating learners, you could motivate learners by providing an enjoyable class, or you could motivate them by wielding your stick and telling them that they have to do something, and they may be motivated to do it for you. But inspiring learners means it means inspiring them to learn by themselves, for themselves, outside your classroom. It means perhaps changing the way they feel about the subject, changing their relationship with the subject area. And we all know that learning a language is a long-term endeavor that takes an enormous amount of effort over many years. And if you as a teacher can persuade a learner to put that necessary effort in, then truly you've done your job, I think. And there is a bit of some research showing that teachers are important in motivating learners. It's actually strange that there is plenty of research into motivation, language learning motivation, but most of it is focused on the learner, the kind of motivation that learners bring to the class. Are they instrumentally motivated or integratively motivated, intrinsically or extrinsically, and so on. And there's remarkably little on how teachers can motivate learners. One study, though, looked at the experiences of language learners looking back at their learning over their lives, and teachers were the most frequently cited motivational influence. My own research with Indonesian learners, I've found that many motivated learners, when reflecting on their experiences, can give an example of a teacher who has inspired them. Not all successful motivated learners can think of a teacher, but some of them did. They could think of, yes, there was so-and-so in my junior high school who she really showed me how important English was, or she was the one who spoke to me in English outside of the class, and that really showed me that English was a means of communication, not just a school subject. Those were the kind of things that they said to me, and that was another reason that I was interested in carrying out this research, to look more systematically for these kind of teachers. And very recently, there has been empirical studies of teachers actually in the act of motivating their learners. So Guilleteau and Dernier, for example, looked at the effects of teaching. They correlated teaching behaviors in class with their learner behavior and matched. So if a teacher was doing a certain thing in class, they were checking to see if learners actually were participating in the class in a motivated way. And they found they could see that correlation. If teachers behaved in a certain way, learners would behave in a certain way. And Moskovsky et al. Most recently did a slightly different study. They looked at, they compared teachers. They looked at the effect of teachers who were teaching in a motivating style over a 4-month course, and compared the learner motivation at the beginning and the end of the course, and found that if the teacher was teaching in a motivating way, the learners became motivated. Not surprising, but it's good to have that research evidence. So, I'd like now to just say a little bit about our research and the aims of the research. As I say, this was conducted by myself and Martin Woodell, my colleague at Leeds. And our aims were to find learners of English in Indonesia and China who felt they had been inspired by a state school teacher that they'd had. Why China and Indonesia? Simply because those were the countries that we knew best. Martin Waddell has spent some time in China and teaching there and doing research there, and I've spent some time in Indonesia living there, like Phil. And so we felt we knew the context reasonably well, and of course we had contacts there who could help us with the research. State school, why state schools? Because that's where the vast majority of learners in China and Indonesia learn their English. So we asked them if they had been inspired, what were the qualities of the teacher that inspired them and what they'd been inspired to do. And then we intended to, once we got the names and schools of some inspiring teachers, we aimed to go and visit them in the school, watch them teach, and talk to them on how they felt they inspired their learners. So, briefly, the methodology then had two phases. Firstly, there was a short online survey that we put up on the web for learners of English who were aged between 14 and 22 in two cities, Guangzhou and Jakarta. We decided to do an online survey because we were kind of faced with a problem, how to get access to learners without going through their current teachers, because we recognized there might be a problem in asking teachers to give their learners a survey or questionnaire about inspiring teachers. They might obviously be influenced. There might be a temptation on the teacher's part to ask the learners to nominate themselves. So we wanted to try and get to the learners without going via their teacher. So we put up a short survey. We publicized this survey mainly through our research assistants, their professional networks in Guangzhou and Jakarta. We also had a Facebook page in Indonesia, not in China because Facebook doesn't operate there. And we hoped that young people in Indonesia, Facebook is very popular in Indonesia, and we hoped that learners might come across this page and, if they were inspired by a teacher, be willing to complete the short questionnaire. The survey was very, very simple. It just asked, have you had an inspiring English teacher? If so, tell us who it is, give us the name and the school and the year. And there were three open items, these three questions. And there was a second phase of the methodology. We then contacted the inspiring teachers. We found 7 teachers, 3 in China, 4 in Indonesia. We observed them teach with and videoed a class, and I'll be showing you a brief extract from the class of a Chinese teacher and an Indonesian teacher. And we talked to them about how they inspired their learners and how they learned to do it. Okay, I'm just going to pause at this point because I'd like you, before I give you our results, I'd just like you to ponder yourself. Did you have an inspiring English teacher? You've all reached a very high proficiency in English. You must have been motivated to learn English. Were you motivated because of a teacher? Did you have an inspiring teacher in your high school? And if so, what were they like? Can I just give you 2 minutes to think about that and maybe tell your neighbor about the teacher if you had one? Okay, well, I'd love to be listening in on your conversations, actually. And I'd be very pleased to talk to you later if you have an inspiring teacher and to hear what they were like. But I'll go on now to describe the results of our research and then eventually to show you some examples of a couple of teachers, one from China, one from Indonesia, who were apparently inspiring. So, some key results then. Frankly, we were disappointed in the response to our online survey. There were 381 responses, but considering that we had contacted through our research assistants at least 150 schools in the two countries, it was slightly disappointing to only get to find that 380 learners had been inspired or were being inspired by their English teacher. But we'd aimed to get 1,000 responses. Well, of course, there's two possible reasons why we got a low response. It could be because our research methods weren't appropriate. Or it could be because inspiring teachers are rare. In order to test that second hypothesis, we gave a supplementary paper survey to one group of learners. These were Indonesian English teachers in training. So these were students at a top university, actually, in Jakarta, a teaching university in the English department. And 228 questionnaires were given out, and we found that 18% of the respondents could name an inspiring teacher. So that gives an indication, I think, that inspiring teachers are, in this context, quite rare. Of course, in India, it may be very different. But in Indonesia, anyway, this is this is evidence that if even teacher trainees, those wanting to be an English teacher who had already learned English very well, if only 18% of them could think of a teacher at school who had inspired them, it does signal that they can't be that common. Okay, let's look then at the qualities of the teachers who were nominated. And there were three broad categories of comments. There were this was the first of the questions where they were asked, what was your teacher like? What was your inspiring teacher like? And we coded and categorized the comments. And about 54% of them related to things that the teacher did. 33% of them were about what the teacher was like as a person or as a professional teacher. And about 13% of them were about the relationship that the teacher had with the students. If we look at these in a bit more detail then, what the teacher did. So what were the aspects of their methodology in class that inspired these learners? The two most common comments were related to giving advice on how students should learn English. This was mentioned by 19%. And how the teachers made English learning fun, enjoyable. There was slight differences in the responses to these in these two areas. So more Chinese learners mentioned the advice on learning, whereas more Indonesians talked about learning being fun. And later I'm going to be talking about the cultural differences or national differences, contextual differences. Other things that teachers mentioned, I'll just let you read these. Okay, moving on then to aspects of personality or professionalism that they mentioned. So again, the most common comments related to the teacher being patient or kind. That's a nice person. Dedicated to their job, being a hard worker, always coming to class on time, that kind of thing. And another frequent comment was that the teacher had very good English, was very knowledgeable, or had good understanding of the world. And then there were, as I say, many comments about the relationship that the teachers had with the learners, about having warm relations, or having a healthy classroom atmosphere. The dynamics in the class were good. And we can compare, so I think in a way, the numbers here sort of underestimate the importance of this personal connection that underlay inspiration. Because all the comments, almost all the respondents were expressing some kind of admiration for their teacher. That they liked their teacher, or at the very least, respected them. There was a genuine human connection there. Briefly then, the second and third questions on the survey looked at what were the effects of the inspiring teacher. I won't dwell on this for very long, but the second question asked, how did your feelings about English change as a result of the inspiring teacher? These are things that they said, the most common things that they said happened to them. And then the third question on the survey asked them, well, what did you do as a result? What did you do as a result of after having this inspiring teacher? And almost all, they mentioned many, many different things, different learning strategies that they used, different skills that they wanted to develop. And there were some interesting differences, again, between what the Chinese learners did and what the Indonesian learners did, which I might mention a bit later. But almost all of them described ways that they had put more effort into learning. So I think our results confirm this kind of basic and very encouraging relationship that inspiring teaching can create motivated learners, and those motivating learners then put effort into learning English. So we can see that teaching matters. It really can lead to, in the long run, to learners who are proficient in English. And if we just compare our results to those of a well-known study by Dernier and Césaire in Hungary. This was one of the very first research studies on teacher motivation. They came up with a list of top 10 commandments for motivating language learners, based on the views of Hungarian English teachers in the 1990s. And we can see that, can just highlight that out of their top 6, certainly our results coincided with theirs. All these things were salient in our results too. The other commandments were less noticeable, so I think we can identify that there are differences between what Hungarian teachers regard as inspiring and what Chinese and Indonesian learners regard as inspiring. For example, I showed you earlier that our learners had talked about how good it was to have teachers who made their classes comprehensible. You know, it was just great to be able to understand everything in their class. Implying that, I guess, in many of their English classes, they found it wasn't very comprehensible. This was not something that was noticeable in Hungary, in the results from Hungary. And another point was about how both Chinese and Indonesian learners valued discipline. They liked teachers. Many of them mentioned that they liked strict teachers, teachers who maintained discipline in the class. Again, this wasn't something that the Hungarian teachers thought was important in motivating learners. Okay, so I'll move on now to talk about two particular teachers, one from China and one from Indonesia, because I want to humanize the research, to kind of put a human face on these the data that I've been showing. And the two teachers, we'll call them Mei Ling from China and Lestari from Indonesia. This is some personal details about them. So both of these teachers had multiple nominations. So learn that these were teachers who, several learners, about 15 in the case of Mei Ling and about 8 in the case of Lestari, had nominated as being inspiring for them. And on the survey, these are some of the comments that the learners made. And I'll let you read them, but what I want to show at this point is how similar the comments seem to be about both these teachers. And a couple more comments. So if you read these learner comments, you might expect that the teachers would, well, to have things in common while they were teaching, and maybe even to teach in a similar way. Because their comments, you could actually mix up their comments and not know which of the two teachers they were talking about. There were some subtle differences, actually. But let's now have a look at these two teachers in action. So I'm going to show you a clip from, first of all, from Mei Ling's class. This was witnessed by my colleague Martin Waddell and videoed. And it's just one lesson. We'll argue that it is reasonably, probably quite representative of their teaching, but it was just one lesson. And we'll show you the video. It's you may not be able to hear the teacher very clearly. I don't think that shouldn't matter too much. I hope you'll be able to figure out what's going on. We'll have a look at Mei Ling first, and then we'll have a look at Lestari's lesson. And they're very short extracts, just 3 or 4 minutes. Okay, so some features of Mei Ling's lesson there, I think you can see. It was planned in minute detail. There were 9 stages in the lesson, in a 45-minute lesson. It was tightly controlled throughout. Learners were active. There wasn't a moment when they didn't have to do something. They were kept on their toes, literally, because they had to stand up when they spoke. Based closely on textbook language. So everything they said in that lesson actually came from the textbook. There was an explicit language focus then throughout, although there was some fluency work as well as accuracy. Translation was being used regularly, as you saw. And throughout, you might have noticed the teacher marking things on the board. That was a competition between groups. There were different groups in the class, and she was giving them mark for their correct responses to each group. And at the end of the lesson, she counted up the scores for each group, and one of the groups won the competition. So that was Mei Ling's lesson. I'll show you now just a very brief extract from Lestari's lesson, the Indonesian teacher.
The most little proportion in this. This is the picture from before. And so, in this discussion part, we can conclude there are 2 ways of eating habit. The first one is the good eating habits, and the next one is the wrong eating habits. If you have the good eating habits, it means that you have 3 times a day or 3 meals a day, and if you have it regularly every day, then you will be healthy. You will be healthy. And the next one is the wrong eating habits. It means that you doesn't have a good eating habit. That you eat an unbalanced diet, and it will cause malnutrition and dysfunction of food in our body. The next one is about survey analysis. We are now this is the result of our survey about breakfast. First question is: do you usually have breakfast before going to school? 84% of students usually have breakfast before going to school.
Okay, so just a very brief glimpse of Lestari's lesson, but the whole lesson was like that. It was student presentations. So there was a kind of irony. We went to watch her lesson to find inspiring teaching, but there was no teaching going on. Of course, the teacher was there, of course, at the back, and she'd made brief comments at the beginning of the lesson, but for the whole 90 minutes of the lesson, it was actually students running the show, presentations throughout. And I would just point out another fundamental difference to the Chinese lesson. What was being said in English was entirely the learner's own meanings. Their own words. They'd carried out, the groups had all done a survey. They each had a topic, and they'd carried out their own little survey with other learners in the school. This one was about their eating habits. And I should have said, by the way, both of these classes were year 9. So they were 14 to 15-year-olds. And good schools, I should say. Both were good state schools, not elite schools by any means, state schools, but you could tell that they were good ones. But in a fairly ordinary neighborhood in Guangzhou, China, and Jakarta, Indonesia. Okay, so what lessons can we draw from these inspiring teachers? As I say, it was only one lesson, but we think it was kind of representative of the way they teach, partly because they knew that they were having to perform for us. So even if it wasn't what they typically do every day, it was what they thought was a motivating or inspiring lesson. And what we can see here then is that similar comments from learners kind of disguise very different teaching styles. And these styles, we might say, are the product of interacting personal and contextual factors. And I'll just explore this over a few minutes. What are these? What are the different personal and contextual influences that made Mei Ling and Listari teach in this way, in ways that were inspiring for their learners, but were quite different from each other? Some of the factors, the contextual factors that we might indicate as being important are these. So things like the educational culture, the way that things are normally done in classrooms in China and Indonesia, the assessment system, the age of the learners, their level, that obviously influences what's done in the class, the dynamics of any particular group of learners. Every class has a slightly different character, doesn't it? The time available, space, and so on. So if we look at these two lessons, we might say, for example, we might identify the assessment system in China as having an influence on the way Mei Ling, a very big influence on the way Mei Ling taught. Perhaps because tests and exams have such a huge influence on Chinese learners' progress, their school careers and their lives, it might encourage a knowledge transmission approach where what was essential was that the learners mastered the language that they knew was going to be in the exam. And of course, learners wanted to get high scores in their exam, so they were motivated to do that. And it also may have encouraged the competition in the class. We saw that the teacher was having this group competition running throughout the class. And that might sort of be a kind of mirror of something done in a playful way, but that competition was a part of all those learners' lives. They knew they were competing against each other in the national exams. We could point to, in Indonesia, the growth of school and teacher autonomy, which teachers in China certainly didn't have. So in Indonesia now, confident and enthusiastic teachers can innovate. They can do pretty much what they want if they feel confident and enthusiastic enough to do it. And maybe that indirectly encourages them to promote learner autonomy as well. Perhaps there are national cultural differences that are affecting what these teachers are doing too. Possibly you could say that the relative openness of Indonesia to the world compared to China promotes a desire in the learners to learn to speak English, to communicate with outsiders, foreigners. So not just English and Americans, by the way, but they're always, when you talk to Indonesian learners, many of them say they want to learn English in order to communicate with people outside the country. Maybe there's something in China, in Chinese culture that encourages that makes learners enjoy disciplined classes, which have lots of hard work in them, possibly. There's also things like time. Lessons in China were 45 minutes, in Indonesia they're 90 minutes. Well, it'd be very difficult to maintain the control that Mei Ling had in her lesson and the energy she showed in teaching for 90 minutes. She could do it for 45 minutes and then she has a short break and then she moves on to the next class. So just the structure of the lesson, the time available, will influence how the teachers teach. And I just want to emphasize this, that we're not talking necessarily about national differences, because there was another Indonesian teacher called Fabrina, who was actually the most nominated teacher. She worked in a school very near Lestari, and she had a very different teaching style. Her lesson was teacher-fronted throughout. There was lots of choral elicitation, several different activities and stages, so in that sense, more like the Chinese teacher. And, but what was different from the Chinese teacher, I think, was there was lots of sort of joking around and teasing of individual students, that kind of thing. So different again. So I'm emphatically not saying this is how all Indonesian teachers teach, or even how all inspiring Indonesian teachers teach. Certainly not. There were no doubt personal factors, though, also that influence how the teachers teach. Their own personalities will influence it. The training they've had, in-service training, and what stage of career they're at. You know, 3 of the 4 Indonesian teachers who we saw did have a very learner-centered style of class. And it may not be a coincidence that those 3 teachers have had quite a lot of in-service training with Western organizations. 2 of them actually been in America for a short time doing training. One of them has taught in a Western language, private language school. So they've been exposed to different ways of doing things. And maybe because they've been abroad, had the confidence as well to innovate as well. So, trying to summarize now, what was inspiring about these teachers? It's very difficult to summarize, but one thing that I think we could say was that all the teachers that we saw, certainly, and what has come across in our survey was that the teachers cared. They cared about their job. And through the interpersonal relationships, that human connection, they showed the learners that they cared about their job. They cared that whether their learners learned English or not. Through their teaching craft, they managed to make the learners themselves care. Some of the learners, not all, of course. These teachers had some nominations, as I said, a handful of nominations. They didn't inspire all the learners in their class. There's always going to be an individual, inspiration is always going to be an individual thing, whether an individual learner connects with an individual teacher. But what they managed to do, I think, was craft their teaching in such a way, appropriately for their particular context, that they maximize the chance of learners being motivated, inspired. But it is very difficult to generalize because we can see that inspiring teaching takes many different forms. And platitudes like that are not necessarily very helpful when it comes to training young teachers on how to be inspiring or how to be motivating. So, it is very difficult to advise teachers on how to do it, how to be motivating. Of course, this hasn't stopped experts from trying to do that, to give advice on how teachers can motivate their learners. Here are 3 examples of books published, very good books, published in the last 10 years on motivating learners. But there are problems. They find it difficult to give advice. For example, we've seen that teacher-fronted teaching can be very motivating. Learner-centered teaching can be very motivating. So which should you advise your trainee teachers to do? Another example is cooperation or competition. What is best? Which motivates more? Encouraging learners to be cooperative with each other or to compete with each other. We saw that Mailing favoured competition and Lestari seemed to favour cooperation learners working in groups. And here we have Dernier, Zoltan Dernier, on page 45 of his book, saying, advice, include activities that involve small group competition games, competitive games, I should say. And then on page 94, saying, promote cooperation instead of competition. So going back to Courtagan again, I think we can only, Zoltan Dernier seems to be contradicting himself, but you can only make sense of that advice in a way if you interpret it in relation to a particular class or particular context. Teaching behavior, as Courtagan says, can only be understood when the original context of the specific teaching behavior is included in the interpretation. And Dernier himself says this. So how can we be inspiring teacher educators then in relation to this aspect of teaching? Penny Ur in her plenary made the point that, all aspects of teaching, we develop expertise mainly through reflection on experience. And that's true probably for learning how to be an inspiring teacher. Yes, there may be the 5% of teachers who are born great. They're born inspiring. They don't have to learn it. But I think the majority of us do have to learn how to be inspiring. And the main way we do it is by looking at the effects of our teaching. Does this work? Does that work? Does it work with this kind of learner? Does it work with that kind of learner? By reflection. However, we can say that there are probably principles of motivational practice that can guide teachers. We can give advice that certain things, that you should behave in this way. However, it always has to be interpreted related to a particular context. And we might also say that interpretation, of knowing how a piece of advice relates to a particular context, should be informed by research as well. And I think that we do need to know, what do inspiring Chinese teachers look like? What do Indonesian inspiring teachers look like? What do Indian inspiring teachers look like? Indian teachers in state schools, Indian teachers in private schools, teachers of university-level students or teachers in primary schools. So research is necessary for us to understand what is inspiring. So I'll end there, and I'd be very interested if anyone would like to collaborate on research into inspiring teachers in India. For now, I'll say thank you in Chinese, Indonesian, English, and Yorkshire. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Martin, for that, for those illuminating insights into qualities of inspiring teachers and strategies that they use. And I think it's been interesting to draw from experiences outside of the Indian context. But obviously they still remain very pertinent to what we're doing here. Now I'd like to invite some questions from the audience. Could you please try and keep them fairly brief and direct, please? Any questions? Yes, please, that gentleman there.
Mr. Lam, it was a wonderful research what this inspiration, what you are talking about, don't you think it is on sale? You go to government schools, what you feel, the students who are in government schools, they don't get the pill of inspiration to swallow. If you go to private schools, of course, teachers are there with special education, maybe with less salary. This question of inspiration is quite controversial. This is what I feel. It's a tragic part of the story. I'm from Himachal, basically. If you go to government schools, I'm repeating my point. The teachers, 9 or 10 teachers, and teaching 10 or 11 students. Even then, no inspiration, takes place. Go to private schools. Sometimes I feel the students in private schools are orphans. Of course, they do have their parents. What do you think inspiration is on sale? And what is the percentage of teachers who really inspire the students? Maybe government schools, maybe private schools. I don't want to see black and white rainbow because it is always colored. What still, there is a question mark. I need something from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, undoubtedly, there are conditions in which it's easier to inspire learners than in others. Probably, I think this was the point you're making, that it's easier if you have a smaller group of learners who themselves maybe come to your class with a positive attitude. It's much easier to inspire them to put effort into learning than it is with a class of 30 or 40 or more learners whose family backgrounds or whose socioeconomic conditions don't it means that they come to school with rather negative attitudes anyway. So yes, it's always going to be easier in certain conditions than others. And I agree with you that probably inspiration is not that common. Our results indicate that. However, that doesn't mean we shouldn't keep on trying to inspire our learners and finding out what it is that makes it happen. Thank you.
It is said that teachers can mold the destiny of nation in the classroom, but most of the teachers in India, they are working for the bell and the bill. It is too difficult to develop ethical and moral knowledge among the teachers. So how should we develop the moral and ethical knowledge to inspire the student in the classroom? I just request to give some tips so that all other teachers could get a guide from you.
I'm sorry, I just couldn't quite catch the meaning there. It's the acoustics.
Yeah. So in our government schools, the teachers are teaching more than just before said that. My friend from Himachal Pradesh, most 10 students, they are teaching to the 10 students, and there are 9 teachers most probably. So government is spending for each single teacher more than 50,000-60,000 rupees for single person if you will calculate the salaries. But we are not getting the results from the students. So there will be, I think, the teachers are not getting inspired with their duties. And our teachers, when I was in the training session, it is said to me that if you are going for the teaching profession, please love the profession, otherwise leave the profession.
Thank you. Yeah, a very important point, I think, that teachers who are not motivated or inspired themselves to teach are very unlikely to inspire their learners, without doubt. Unlikely, but not impossible, actually, I think, because it's always this personal connection. I mean, just to give you a little anecdote, I asked my students in Leeds recently about whether they'd been inspired, and one girl stood up and said, yes, I was inspired by my teacher. I was 13 years old. My teacher had told me, she was a very strict teacher, she told me to do some homework, and we told us all to do some homework. I came to the class the next morning, and she pointed to me and said, stand up, and tell me what you learnt in your homework. And she couldn't do it. And she sat down feeling terribly humiliated. But she said, from that moment on, I was determined to learn English well and to become good. So she actually derived inspiration from a negative experience. So it is still possible that inspiration can happen in your class even without you being aware of it, I think.
So what was the theoretical framework behind your research? Like, did you have any any scales to measure the framework to measure the inspiration levels of the teachers? Did you have any scales to measure the inspiration of the teachers while conducting this research?
Thank you. We didn't actually have a theoretical framework. We had, as I said, there isn't a lot of research on motivational teaching. And we wanted to keep it deliberately open. As you saw, our survey questions were very open. We wanted, because there hasn't been a lot of research on motivational teaching, and particularly not with Asian learners, we kept our instrument quite open in order to find what came. And then we tried to categorize the responses, as we've shown. So, no, the brief answer is no, we didn't actually start with a theoretical framework. Thank you.
So my question is, if my students are from tribal areas and there is no educational background to them, so how can I inspire such students?
Thank you.
Who are tribal students?
I would just say, first of all, on the basis of our research, the way you can inspire your learners is by showing you care. Because whatever their background, if they see that you care, then there's a chance that they may begin to care themselves. However, beyond that sort of human connection, I'll be very tentative about offering advice, because I think you have to find out from your learners what motivates them, what might motivate them. And of course, more experienced teachers in your context, in your environment, may know as well. The experienced teachers, the ones who are still motivated themselves, they will know what works. So they are the better people to ask than me, actually.
And finally, could we have a last question from Amol, please, at the back?
Hello. Just a simple question, Martin. At an earlier point in your presentation, the slide read, inspiring English teachers are rare. Did you mean to say that there are very few English teachers whom we find inspiring, or inspiring teachers in general are rare?
Thanks, Amol. I meant to say that I think there are many on the basis of our research, you'll find many motivated learners of English in China and in Indonesia these days, and many learners who are successfully learning. But I think what our research is saying is that teachers are not often the main source of that motivation. And perhaps that is true in India too. I don't know. I think there should be research to find out. So I think it is rare, and it should be higher. I think probably, by the way, if we did the similar research in Britain about whether there are many inspiring, whether teachers of French or German or Spanish in Britain inspire their learners to learn, we might also find that the numbers are quite low. And what also I should stress, I'm not saying that these teachers are necessarily doing a bad job. It's just that for whatever reason, maybe because of the difficulties of the conditions they work in, things like poor salaries, lack of available resources and so on, that inspiration, these moments of inspiration don't happen very often. And we should try to find out why that is and try to maximize it as far as we can.
Okay, thank you very much, Martin, and apologies to those of you who didn't get a chance to ask a question, but we have run out of time and it's now time for coffee. So could you please give a warm thank you to Martin?
Thank you.